The savage beasts in Italy have their dens, they have their places of repose and refuge. But the men who bear arms and expose their lives for the safety of their country, they enjoy in the meantime nothing more in it, but are forced to wander from place to place with their wives and children. The words of Tiberius Gracchus, a soldier and statesman, speaking to the people of Rome in 133 BC. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 24th episode of my podcast series on the Roman Empire. Today's episode introduces us to a period in Roman history known as the Late Roman Republic. The Punic Wars are over, and Rome is now undisputed ruler of most of the Mediterranean, with only certain Greek areas in Egypt and elsewhere still independent. Rome has become both powerful and wealthy, but as in all wealthy cultures, the wealth has been channeled mostly to the upper classes. Tiberius Gracchus, a young officer in the army, saw the poverty of the Roman people and was determined to do something about it after he was elected to the office of tribune. His movement would light the fires of revolution in Rome and bring on the century of decline that preceded the arrival of the empire. But before we get into that, please remember to visit my website at western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org, where you can find the episodes from all my podcast series about everything from the ancient world, Greek history, the Bible, and an assortment of other topics pertinent to Western civilization. And please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. These are easy ways to support my work. If you wish to contribute more directly to the cause, you can find links to PayPal or to Patreon on my website. If you become a Patreon member, you get access to behind the scenes happenings in the podcast, updates about the future direction of things, and I also post interesting historical links and videos about topics pertinent to the past, present, and future of the West. Now, though, with that aside, let's return to Rome in the wake of her complete victory over Carthage in 145 BC and see how Roman society was changing, for better or for worse, as her power grew. In previous episodes, I made increasing reference to the way that wealth was changing Roman society during the era of the Punic Wars. Rome had, of course, always been a society of class stratification, and to be sure, in the early days of the Republic, the patricians had lived lives of more privilege and power than the plebs, but they also shared a great many of the daily struggles of common people. That is to say, the distance between rich and poor was less in those days. Patricians still worked their own land in those days. Their labor was augmented but not replaced by slaves or by hired hands, and slaves were relatively few. Most Romans, even if you would argue that they were somehow oppressed by the upper classes, most Romans owned their own land and worked it to their own benefit. But all this had changed. The wars had brought wealth into Rome, vast wealth, not simply wealth in the form of more land, but wealth in gold and silver, in fine art, in the jewelry and the precious stones of conquered peoples. No longer did a rich man have to wonder if the state of his wealth would rise or fall based on the success of the next harvest or the success of his cattle breeding that year. No, now he possessed liquid wealth as well, the flow of silver from the mines in Spain and the gold earned from high seas trade and from conquest. And with the influx of wealth had also come a torrent of slaves. Much like the upper classes in the West today, the patricians immigrated slaves into their country, easier to maintain and easier to discipline and oppress than the free men of the countryside. These slaves slowly began to replace the native Romans living in rural areas, and the superior wealth of the patricians had allowed them to buy up the land of their smaller competitors, or to outcompete them, and they had driven the free populace into the cities to seek labor and their daily bread. I'm speaking here of the rise of the latifundia, that's Latifundia, latifundia, the large land holdings of the rich in Rome, which only grew larger as the years and decades passed, as they irrigated and used the wealth from conquest to push out the small farmers. And much as we see in our society today as well, the men who had won all this wealth for Rome, the common soldiers, who had lived on meager, meatless diets for years and who suffered and were broken by the wounds of combat, the men of the legions, these men had been cast aside by their rulers, forgotten about. They had lost their farms, which were often poorly managed while they were away fighting Rome's wars. Men often came back from war and found themselves forced to go into debt to save their land, and then they could not ever pay back the debt unless a richer man bought them out and left them quote unquote free to go to the city and then seek a living through labor. And when they could not find a living in the city, these masses of hungry men, proud men who had fought for Rome, but were now reduced to living off handouts, these men became, understandably, unruly. Tiberius Gracchus might seem like an unlikely leader for this growing mass of restless, angry men. He was born into the Roman aristocracy. His father, as we often see in Roman history, bore the exact same name, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, so you might become confused reading Roman history often as to who is who. The father of this episode's subject was well known for his military acumen in the first part of the 2nd century BC, decades prior to the Third Punic War. When he was already approaching 50 years of age, the senior Tiberius Gracchus married an 18-year-old woman by the name of Cornelia. Now, this Cornelia, mother of the Tiberius of whom I speak in this episode, came from her own illustrious line of descent. Her father had been Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Carthage in the Second Punic War, and her mother had come from the line of Aemilius Paulus. She had 12 children with her middle aged husband, and one of her daughters would marry Scipio Aemilianus, the man who won the Third Punic War. So all her descendants would therefore come from a line of great renown and heraldry in Roman political and social circles. Young Tiberius had lived up to the heroic expectations of Roman history. I mentioned in the last podcast that at the age of just 16 years old, Tiberius was the first over the walls at the final attack on Carthage in 146 BC. And he continued his prodigal advancement in life. Young to be in battle, he was also young to be elected to the office of augur in Rome. The augurs, you might remember, were an important part of Roman religion and politics. I won't get into the details of their work and their rituals, but they performed rites involving things such as looking at and interpreting the meaning of bird flights, and they were possibly involved in sacrifices. They were not the same as priests. They were not the flamen, as the Romans called their priestly class, but they played an integral role even in high level decision making, including how and when to go to war, whom to elect as consul, and so on. Now, ever since the Second Punic War, when Rome had seized control of much but not all of the Iberian Peninsula, the Roman Republic had been waging wars of territorial expansion there. In the northern portion of modern day Spain, there were a people known as the Numantians. The Romans had been in off and on conflict with them for many years. Rome would, of course, eventually win this conflict, but in 137 BC, the young Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was a quaestor on the staff of the consul leading the war effort there. The office of quaestor could indicate many sorts of middle management roles in ancient Rome. At this particular point in history, it sort of signified the treasurer of a military body, the man responsible for keeping the accounts. That particular year, the Roman forces found themselves surrounded by the enemy and ended up negotiating a treaty of surrender. It is believed that Tiberius's presence in the negotiations may have saved the lives of many Romans that day, because his father was remembered fondly by the locals for his less aggressive and less acquisitive diplomacy many decades before. However, upon returning to Rome, the consul who had surrendered and his whole staff were subjected to rebukes from the Senate. The surrender had humiliated Rome. The consul who had led the army was stripped of his citizenship and sent back to Numantia. Though the Numantines refused to accept him, honoring the surrender as it was negotiated, and they returned him to Rome safely. Tiberius ultimately escaped censure in this affair, and it didn't seem to stop his quick ascent through the cursus honorum, that series of offices that aristocratic men were expected to hold on their way to possibly becoming consuls someday. But this certainly marked Tiberius's first moment of opposition to the Senate and the Roman establishment. Now, he went on to be elected as a tribune in 133 BC. This would be the same year that he died, and the same year that a revolution began in Rome and would not come to a real end until Octavian, the heir of Julius Caesar, assumed total imperial power a century later. Tiberius's younger brother, Caius Gracchus, later described in writing an episode that may have sparked his older brother's political transformation. When he was on his way to the Numantine War, Tiberius had to travel through Tuscany to the north of Rome on his way to Spain. Here, the young officer witnessed firsthand the radical demographic changes that had taken place in the Roman Republic. According to Plutarch, he, quote, found the country almost depopulated, and there being hardly any free husbandmen or shepherds, but for the most part only barbarian imported slaves. Tiberius saw that this was obviously all a result of the way that available land had all moved into the possession of the ultra wealthy. You see, Rome had come into possession of much land due to the wars of conquest, and there had been already in previous decades a great deal of social struggle about who was to receive these public lands. In the end, there had been a somewhat general distribution to the patricians as well as to the general populace of free men, but over the years, the wealthy had maneuvered themselves into ownership of virtually all of that quote unquote public land. Now, there was a law on the books which prevented an individual from owning more than 500 acres of land, but the wealthy had gotten around this by using other people's names, kind of like how the rich use shell companies to hide their identities today, and thus had been created the latifundio, which I mentioned earlier. Now, furthermore, Tiberius saw the lamentable state of existence into which many brave former soldiers had fallen. He saw how the best men of Rome were suffering in poverty, landless, while the rich enjoyed decadent lives of leisure. When he was elected as tribune of the people, he orated on the dichotomy between the lives of the wealthiest and the lives of the poorest in Rome. Most of all, he lamented the way that the common soldiers had been betrayed by their country. Military commanders, he said, exhorted common soldiers to fight for their altars, that is, to defend their households and the lands on which the tombs of their forefathers lay, when in reality the common soldiers came from no such privileged background. They no longer had any land. They could not afford costly sepulchres for their ancestors. They had long ago sold everything away to pay debts. Instead, they fought simply to sustain and expand the wealth of their leaders, and they were doomed to return to civilian life someday with nothing. To repair this situation, the new young tribune came before the assembly and proposed a bill to be passed. The resulting new law would, if passed, name a three-man land commission whose goal would be to investigate the ownership of these lands and, in as many cases as possible, return those parcels to the common people. But this was all to be done without any acrimony or any retaliation on those who might have wrongly acquired those lands in the past. However, in the political system of the Roman Republic, it was one of the key roles of the two popularly elected tribunes in the assembly to be able to stop any legislation with the casting of a simple veto. The wealthy interests in society, therefore, lobbied Tiberius's friend and fellow tribune Marcus Octavius to cast his veto now, to stop, in a perfectly legal fashion, the legislation that countered their interests. Now, ultimately, it may not have been too hard to convince Marcus Octavius to betray his friend because he himself, Marcus Octavius, was among those who had wrongly acquired these public lands and whose wealth depended on them. Tiberius Gracchus, irritated by this denial of his will, now proposed a harsher law, which would simply command the rich to give up their wrongly acquired lands. To avoid complications with his friend Octavius, Tiberius offered to pay for his friend's losses when the bill became law. Yet this bill too was stymied by his friend's refusal, and the bill then stagnating in the time consuming complexities of the legislative process, which were meant to kill bills without the drama of a veto. The political machinations of today are nothing new. But now the story becomes a little perplexing, for me anyway, because Tiberius's following actions seem unusually powerful for what we know about the legislative roles of the tribunes of Rome. Now, seeing that his law would not be able to pass by the usual means, Tiberius unilaterally put forth an order to stop the work of all judges in Rome until his proposed bill was either passed into law or rejected. He sent men to seal the gates of the Temple of Saturn, which was where the Republic's treasury was located, so that no government funds could go out, nor could any be collected. Furthermore, he threatened all who disobeyed his commands with fines. Now, this part of the political drama is confusing because up to now, the story of Rome has been one of a sort of supreme senate and the battlefield struggles of the consuls, whom we are told held the executive power of the state. How could one young, lowly tribune cause such a ruckus in the great and powerful Roman Republic, especially when we are told that the tribune's primary power was merely that of the veto? It would appear to me, anyway, that the Roman political structure must have evolved over time in some way that isn't clearly spelled out by these surviving histories. And indeed, we have already seen this in the podcast how the kings gave way to the Senate and the consuls, and how the dynamics between the Senate and the consuls changed over time. It would appear from this and other political dramas that we will soon hear about that more power had, to some extent, flowed into the hands of the tribunes and the lower assemblies over time. At the very least, Tiberius Gracchus was able to exercise the power of demagoguery, if not actual legislative or executive power. He was basically among those men of history who knew that they had the power of the masses behind them, and this power was a more effective tool than any of those found in political procedures. When the day of the vote came, though, Marcus Octavius, Tiberius's friend, could not resist the will of the wealthy men who backed him, and he let Tiberius know that he would still veto the bill. And then Tiberius went nuclear on his friend. He put it to the vote of the tribes to remove Octavius as tribune and thus eliminate the possibility of a veto stopping his law. The vote passed, and Octavius was removed from the chamber in a chaotic struggle. Tiberius's servants protected his old friend from harm, but one of these servants had his eyes torn out in the battle. So savage had the political climate become. The Lex Sempronia Agraria. A three-man commission was formed consisting of Tiberius himself, his father-in-law, and his younger brother Caius, who was actually not even present but instead was still serving in the army in Spain. Clearly, this was a huge, naked power grab, but by now there was so much public will behind Tiberius Gracchus that the Senate apparently could not risk stopping him outright. Now, a short time later, one of Tiberius's friends suddenly died of some disease, and the rumor spread that he had been poisoned, and the public was further inflamed. The Senate had a chance to revenge itself, though, on Tiberius when the king of Pergamum, an ally of Rome, also died that year, and he left his estate and his lands to the Roman Republic. Now, Tiberius proposed that these lands should be given then to the people. But the Senate spread a rumor that Tiberius had received from this king of Pergamum a purple robe and a crown for him to wear when he became king over Rome. The story of Julius Caesar's death a century later should remind us of how seriously the Roman Senate and the people feared such royal aspirations in powerful men, and this rumor also revealed cracks in the foundations of Tiberius's support. Just as now in our time, the masses are swayed by media stories that turn men into heroes or villains in the blink of an eye. Now, neither should we think that all of the people, all of the common people, believed in Tiberius from the get go anyway. Many commoners were certainly concerned already by his arrogation of power, by his removal of a duly elected tribune who had simply exercised his office in implementing a veto. And of course, as the rumor about the purple robe and the crown suggested, Tiberius certainly seemed to be threatening to become a monarch, whether this was true or not. To win over these doubters, Tiberius, at a rapid pace, began to propose laws which might please the public. That the years of required military service might be reduced, for example, and he moved to elevate men from the knightly class to the Senate, to essentially create new patricians who might be gratefully loyal to him. While these bills were tossed back and forth in the legislative process, the public tumult only became worse. Tiberius's residence was soon surrounded by tents of supportive commoners who thought to protect him from assassination. And then the yearly elections rolled around again. It was now late 133 BC, time to choose new tribunes for the next year, and Tiberius decided to again buck tradition and run for a second sequential year as tribune. And now I must bog down the narrative to relate something that we must always remember when studying the ancient Romans. You and I most likely hear all this drama, and we think primarily of the political and social motives and consequences of it all. But never forget at any point in the story about the religious aspect of the story, because the Romans, whether they were upper or lower class, were not just profoundly religious, but from our perspective, they were overwhelmingly superstitious. Never forget in all this Roman history the importance of omens. This holds true all the way down to Constantine seeing the vision of the cross before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge centuries later. But at this juncture, in 133 BC, and it was still just 133 BC, all of these momentous events had happened during Tiberius Gracchus's first and only term as tribune. At this time, Tiberius was confronted with what he interpreted to be several omens. Among them were the following. Now, Tiberius owned an expensive and showy set of headgear that he had worn for battle during his career as a soldier. Into this ornate helmet, according to the surviving story, one night two serpents had recently slithered in and laid their eggs, and the young had later come squirming out. And while remembering this instance, this omen, Tiberius and some of his entourage left his home to head over to the capital for the election, and as he did, he stumbled over the threshold and broke a toenail, and the damage was so severe that blood gushed out of the wound. And then again, going on his way, he saw two ravens fighting on the rooftop of a house as he passed, and a stone that was knocked loose in this squabble fell at his feet. Now, this, Plutarch tells us, startled even the boldest of his companions. Remember that these were all omens to these men. Nevertheless, though, they continued on to the capital, and the omens notwithstanding, it was a glorious entrance. Crowds of people welcomed him with loud cries, and he took his place surrounded by numerous followers, eager to defend him from harm. But there was so much disorder on the floor that no business could be carried out. Tiberius suggested that his wealthy enemies, then, were conspiring to assassinate him. In the ruckus that followed, his opponents fled the scene and took refuge in the Senate house. In hiding, the consul was among them. Many of the patrician leaders asked the consul to use his power to punish Tiberius, who was surely seeking to become the tyrant of Rome. When the nervous consul refused to act outside of legal procedure, the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, who was also a cousin of Tiberius Gracchus, cried out, "Since the consul regards not the safety of the commonwealth, let everyone who will defend the laws follow me." And these rallied patricians marched back to the capital. They took with them what arms they could find as they went staves, clubs, and they even grabbed the fragments of furniture broken in the morning's tumult. And with these and their zeal for liberty and personal interest, they overcame Tiberius's defenders, who either escaped with their lives or joined their demagogue in death. For die he did. Tiberius was slain while trying to flee the battle. The victors refused him burial. They threw his body and the bodies of his slain companions into the river that night. But Tiberius's cause was victorious in his death. The people were by no means cowed by this retaliation, and the Senate well knew this. The legislation to divide public lands stood, and the Land Commission was permitted to go ahead with its work. Tiberius's younger brother, Caius, now in Rome, was appointed one of the three men to lead the commission. But if this generosity was meant to deter Caius from following his brother's path, it failed to do so. The much younger man, Caius was just 22 years old, he burned with an even greater zeal for the cause, and his brother's murder just added fuel to the fire. It's funny because people often overlook the Republican period of Rome and they think only of the quote unquote glory of the empire that came after the death of Julius Caesar. But the truth is that the glory really came before the empire. The story of the empire is one of oppression, cruelty, endless bloodshed. Empires are generally just juggernauts of barely controlled chaotic forces held together by the frequently challenged power of one man. Most of the territorial expansion of Rome occurred under the Republic, and its most noteworthy heroes are from the Republican era. No one, not any emperor or general from the imperial era, will ever display the character of a Cincinnatus, a Marcellus, a Fabius, or a Scipio Africanus. And the transition to the ugliness of the empire really picks up here. In the late 2nd century BC, is Tiberius really responsible for destabilizing the pseudo democracy of the late Republic, or was he merely kicking out the supports under a corrupt and foundering legal structure that had become a tool of oppression rather than a vehicle of liberty and prosperity? Or perhaps we make a mistake in glorifying the so called democracy of ancient Rome, much like we gaslight ourselves into believing that our modern governments are representative and responsible. Maybe it was, just like all human institutions of governance, just a makeshift apparatus to protect the interests of the rich and tolerate the needs of the poor only so much as necessary. Caius Gracchus will follow his older brother into political struggle and into martyrdom. In the next episode, we will begin to study the series of individuals who would become strong men over the faltering republic, whose Senate would essentially surrender authority to whomever was willing to take the reins and the responsibility of power. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.